Chapter 3. As they rushed toward the exit, dozens of armored and weapon-handed augments charged toward them. Victor and Sig cut most of them down with well-placed shots. A few of them got close, but Jonathan swirled around with his blades slicing through them. Victor was impressed with Jonathan's speed and accuracy. The pillars and stones that had provided awe on the trip in seemed to provide cover for dozens of knife-handed augments. In spite of their survival of the fittest philosophy, they had no reservations throwing themselves at gunfire from Sig and Victor, or sword slices from Jonathan. Lizard scurried rapidly around, knocking several augments into one another. Although there was an increase in resistance, Victor was surprised by the ease with which they made their way toward the exit. Somewhere in the gunfire, he thought he heard another loud shriek. He knew that there was something they were not taking into account. The ricochet of bullets bouncing across the old stone surfaces put everyone on edge, except for the swarms of augments trying to prove themselves by defeating the invaders. Finally, the entrance to the shrine came into view. Lucas immediately grabbed Lizard's arm. "No charges yet," he shouted over the deafening gunfire. "Epsilon 41 is outside." Lizard was obviously disappointed, but nodded in acknowledgement. Lizard began motioning for everyone to get outside quickly. "They could seal us in here," shouted Lucas. The group rushed toward the exit, taking down as many augments as they could. At last they exited the shrine. A dozen grenades bounced toward them. In an amazing show of speed and accuracy, Jonathan leapt toward them and batted them away as he spun around with his sword. The pressure of the blast threw everyone back, but there were very few shrapnel cuts. Sig leapt to his feet and grabbed those closest to him, urging everyone out a bit further. Charges had already been placed on the outside of the doors, and in a moment a second blast went off. The entry quickly filled with rubble. Everyone was covered with scrapes and dirt, but Sig still stood with a smile as he saw that everyone had survived. As they slowly got up, they saw the huge ball-shaped augment, Epsilon 41, that Victor had described. It had tank treads that wrapped around it vertically, propelling it forward. It came to a rest in the snow about 100 yards from them. Next to it stood a group of about a dozen lesser augments. One of the augments must have been a middle-tier sensor type, since he had mechanical plates around his ears that flexed around as if he were a cat pinpointing his prey. "You have taken property from me," shouted Epsilon 41 in a mechanical voice. "If you return it, I will reward your display of fitness by allowing you to survive." "The only property that I have for you is buckshot," shouted Sig with a grin. He began rushing toward Epsilon 41, blasting away with his shotgun. Lizard scurried toward him and began hitting the lesser augments. The sensor augment retreated back as Jonathan rushed toward him. Victor began picking off augments with his pistol, and the augments began firing back. "Don't be so casual with your lives," shouted Daniel angrily. "Lizard, over there," shouted Lucas, pointing to the sensor. Lizard smiled and leapt toward him, but to everyone's surprise, a large man that had been augmented with mechanical wings and claws swooped down from the top of the shrine and grabbed Lizard. Lizard struggled to escape as he was carried into the air. "Kill him, Charon 19, shouted Epsilon 41. The flying augment nodded as it shoved Lizard into the ground. "You cannot escape," said Charon 19. "You do not deserve to survive." Before Charon 19's claws could pierce Lizard, a loud shot echoed across the snow, and Charon 19 was sent reeling on his back. Lizard looked back to see augments springing up out of the snow around Kirana, who fired the shot that saved him. "How did they know where she was?" whispered Victor to himself. Lucas also looked worried, and had begun firing at the augments around her. Jonathan also rushed to her aid. She unveiled her own pair of katanas, and began slicing through her enemies. Charon 19 recovered from the hit, and flew at Lizard as he was getting up. Lizard was able to leap away from Charon 19's claws, but one of his large metal wings hit Lizard's head and knocked him down. Charon 19 scooped him up and threw him toward Daniel, who had been making his way up to help Lizard. The two of them crashed down in the snow. "Are you okay?" asked Daniel. "Define okay," said Lizard. "See, that's too much with the air quotes," said Daniel. Daniel bandaged Lizard's arms that had been sliced by Charon 19's claws. Lizard looked back while he was being treated and noticed Lucas placing an explosive charge on the rubble blocking the entrance to the shrine. "What is he doing?" whispered Lizard. "Aren't we trying to escape?" Daniel looked back and watched as Lucas blasted the clay and reopened the entrance to the shrine. He began shouting something, but with all the gunfire they could not hear him. Lucas turned to them, motioned to the entrance, and went back in. "Whatever he's doing, we need to follow him," said Daniel. He helped Lizard up. An augment with sword arms rushed toward Daniel, but Lizard punched him in the face and knocked him out. The two began moving back toward the entrance. Victor and Sig dodged rolling charges from Epsilon 41. The Augment Master obviously cared nothing for his subordinates, since he crushed most of them trying to squash Victor and Sig. Fortunately, the mass of the ball and the slickness of the snow prevented Epsilon 41 from maneuvering quickly, and they could leap sideways and avoid being crushed. While Epsilon 41 tried to guess which way they would leap and turn quickly, he would always end up sliding straight for long enough that he could not harm them. Kirana was nearly flawless in her spinning and slicing as augments around her tried to hack her with sword and axe arms, but she failed to notice a small augment climb up a nearby tree and leap toward her. Fortunately, Jonathan arrived just in time to slice off the sharp hooks it had in place of hands before it landed on Kirana. After another swing of Jonathan's sword, the last augments that had ambushed Kirana were defeated. "How did they find me?" demanded Kirana angrily. Jonathan had hoped his quick assistance would have earned him a warmer reception. He shrugged. Kirana noticed the disappointed look on Jonathan's face. She lowered her eyes, regretting the sharpness in her tone. "All right," she said at last. "Oh, and thanks for getting that guy." Jonathan's face beamed with happiness. Kirana looked at the ground, waiting for something to end the awkward silence. "So," said Jonathan as he scratched the back of his head awkwardly, "I guess we should head back to the shrine. It looked like Lucas came up with something." Kirana nodded. The two of them rushed down the snowy slope toward the entrance and caught up with Lizard and Daniel. "How are you guys doing?" asked Jonathan. Daniel gave an unhappy look. Lizard shrugged. "Where's that flying guy?" asked Kirana. "And their sensor." Lizard turned to point to the spot where Charon 19 had skidded to a halt. Instead, he saw nothing. They whirled around looking for him, but saw only Epsilon 41 rushing toward Victor and Sig again. Looking up, they saw Charon 19 swoop down and grab Daniel. Lizard leapt up and grabbed Charon 19's legs. The extra weight pulled Charon 19 to the ground, where he released them and flew toward Victor with incredible speed. Sig caught sight of him and leapt in front of Victor. Victor's eyes grew wide with worry as he saw Charon 19 barreling toward them. "No!" shouted Victor. Sig pushed Victor out of the way and gave him a grin as Charon 19 crashed into Sig and pushed him back about 50 yards. To Victor's surprise, Sig seemed to have absorbed the impact. Sig then grabbed one of the metal wings on the back of Charon 19's back and ripped it off, leaving him screaming. Victor's eyes grew wide at this feat of strength and will. Sig kicked the augment back into the snow. "Charon 19, said Epsilon 41, "you have failed. You are not fit to survive." "No," screamed Charon 19, "I can be repaired." "Run," shouted Sig. Kirana, Jonathan, Daniel, Lizard, and Victor used the confusion to rush into the entrance with Lucas. Sig stayed outside, firing his guns enthusiastically to provide cover as they climbed into the hole in the rubble next to Lucas. Epsilon 41 rushed toward Charon 19 and crunched him under the large heavy treads of his shell. Sig dashed back to the shrine to find that Lucas and the others were safe inside. The hole in the rubble was not large enough to allow Epsilon 41 in through the entrance, but the augment crashed against it a couple of times anyway. Perhaps he meant to threaten them. After a few more attempts, Epsilon 41 rolled back and began shouting. "Row 82, he shouted. "You are now responsible for finding them. Get the relic they found if you want to survive." The loud shrieking sound that they had heard several times suddenly echoed through the shrine. Victor covered his ears in discomfort. "That must be the sensor type," said Lucas. "Let's head back into the shrine. Our plan is still to take out the sensor. This will separate him from his master." They began walking further in, keeping their weapons ready for any other augments that might be waiting to ambush them. Lucas continued his explanation. "I'm sure Kirana noticed, but their sensor was able to detect her in spite of her stealth," said Lucas. "Yes," said Kirana in a frustrated voice. "How did they do that?" "That row 82 that is hunting us," said Lucas. "The one that has been screeching." "I don't care who he is," said Kirana with a frown. "How did he find me? I masked my body heat, I was silent, I made no mistakes." "It's a sonar-like technique," said Lucas. "Sonar?" asked Kirana. "Yes," said Lucas. "Your body is of course a different density than the snow, so they snuck other augments close to you, waiting for when you made a move." "That means he can detect us even if we hide," said Sig. "We can't set a trap or an ambush." "Not necessarily," said Lucas with a smile. "I'll need to modify a couple of our radios, and we need to go further underground." They handed a pair of radios to Lucas, and he began tinkering with them as they went into a deeper chamber. On the roof of the shrine, row 82 flexed the plates around his ears. A dozen lesser augments stood with him. Row 82 opened his mouth and released another terrible shriek. He paused and flexed the plates around his ears again. "They're trying to go into the lower passages outside my range," said row 82 as he turned to his team. "Do not fall behind. Only the fit will survive." They gathered quickly to a roof on the shrine. One of his team shot a grappling hook from the spot where a hand would have been toward a stone outcropping in the roof on which they stood. The team of augments helped pull him as they lifted up a chunk of concrete, creating an opening in the ceiling of the shrine. After clearing additional chunks of concrete, they created a hole through which they were able to fit. One by one they leapt down into the shrine, hoping to catch the invaders that had taken the treasure of the sealed shrine. As the augments rushed down the halls following row 82's commands, they readied their weapon hands. Eager to prove themselves in combat, they stormed quickly through the passages. At length they came to a spiral staircase that led to some of the slave chambers below. Row 82 held up a hand, asking for his men to be silent. He then opened his mouth unnaturally wide and delivered another shriek that echoed through the entire shrine. The plates around his ears twitched around for several moments. After some time, he tilted his head to the side in confusion. Again, row 82 opened his mouth and gave a shriek. He closed his eyes to focus on the sounds. With concentration, he had learned to hear each sound in sequence. The machines that had been surgically attached to his brain gave him an interpretation of his surroundings that he could see. He watched the picture of his surroundings clarify. He saw the spacious chamber they were in. He saw each step in the staircase. He could see the frightened and confused slaves huddling in corners together. He could see down further into chambers below where Epsilon 41 tortured slaves for his pleasure. He could see above to the roof of the shrine. The intruders had completely vanished. Row 82's face went flush as he imagined what Epsilon 41 would do if he discovered his prize had been lost. "Are they lost?" asked one of the augments, sensing row 82's concern. "No," shouted row 82. "They don't even know I'm using sonar." What would they do if they did know that? Asked another of the augments. The question was insulting to Row 82. No one he had hunted had discovered how he was able to see through so many clever disguises. He wished that Epsilon 41 had not disclosed his secret to the common augments, but he had relied on the resources of his current master to maintain his augmentation, so he did not argue the point. Suddenly he stopped taking the question personally and wondered to himself what would happen if someone discovered his secret. How would they avoid detection? "They are clever, though," said Row 82. He closed his eyes and shrieked again. The metallic flaps around his ears quivered as he envisioned the chambers below. He checked every place as they appeared before him. Suddenly he found a block of solid material that seemed out of place. "The density is higher there than it should be," said Row 82. "Let's go." The augments stormed down the stairs and through other chambers. Several augments had trouble keeping up with Row 82 as he sprinted toward the chamber that had appeared solid. Slaves huddled together as they watched the augments rush. Row 82 ignored the hushed whispers of the slaves as he focused on his target. He was determined to prove his abilities made him superior. At last the augments reached a closet door. Row 82 skidded to a halt and motioned for the others to follow. Several of the augments had machine gun attachments on their arms. Row 82 motioned for them to stand ready. The grappling hook augment fired at the wooden door and reeled it toward him. The machine guns went off for 60 seconds without ceasing. Sweeping the room with bullets, they laughed at their triumph. As they emptied their supply of ammunition, the ringing of bullets and ricochets slowly faded. Row 82 peered into the room. To his horror, there was only a bullet-ridden radio on the floor. "Clever," said Row 82. He shrieked again. He closed his eyes as he focused on each image. At the end of his stream, where the images became less clear, he saw them rushing back toward the entrance. He wondered how he had missed them. "Epsilon 41!" shouted Row 82 as he rushed back the way they had come. As they ran, he noticed the huddling slaves shivering in fear as they passed. They looked away to avoid eye contact. He suddenly realized what had happened. They had doubled back after he had stopped shrieking. The silence had signaled to them that he had discovered their radio jamming trick. They blended right in with the slaves, knowing that he would rush past them without checking. The machine guns covered their exit, and now they had Epsilon 41 by himself. Row 82 was not worried about the welfare of the augment master, but he was worried that Epsilon 41 would not be able to keep them from escaping. While his defense seemed impenetrable, he was not equipped to detect and hunt prey. And if the intruders escaped, it would be Row 82 in the torture chambers having his limbs pulled off. As he was running, he gave another shriek. Row 82's face went white with fear. They had left the shrine. Sig fired his pump-action shotgun repeatedly at Epsilon 41. He had a wide grin on his face, obviously enjoying himself, even though his weapons could not penetrate the thick shell of the augment master. "You are fit," observed Epsilon 41, "but not fit enough to survive against me. I have an absolute defense." Sig laughed out loud as he traded his shotgun for pistols and began firing away at Epsilon 41. The augment master began rolling on his tank treads to crush Sig. The others immediately rushed out the exit. Daniel took off for the woods, and Victor followed him. Victor turned and fired a few rounds at Epsilon 41 as they fled. "There will be no escape," shouted Epsilon 41. "Only the fit will survive." He began rushing at Victor. "Augments never shut up about their survival of the fittest," said Victor as he ran next to Daniel. "Yeah," agreed Daniel. "It's worse than lizards. Air quotes." "If only the fit will survive, you won't make it to see another day," taunted Sig with a smile, hoping to draw him back. A small hatch opened on the side of Epsilon 41's shell, and a rocket fired out toward Sig. "Oh crap, whispered Sig. "Didn't see that coming." Sig dove into the snow, but the rocket grazed his arm before lodging into the ground a few feet away from him. Lizard scurried at it and hurled it back toward Epsilon 41. It exploded harmlessly in the air. "Nice work, Lizard," said Sig. Jonathan and Kirana rushed up beside the Augment Master and began slashing the shell with their swords. Their attacks bounced off. Epsilon 41's shell suddenly opened a series of tiny ports, and long spears sprang out. Both Jonathan and Kirana ducked down and rolled out of the way before getting back to their feet. Epsilon 41 spun around in place. Though the sharp points of the spears had not impaled Kirana or Jonathan, the round metal surfaces being swung around turned the spears into bats that smacked the two of them hard, sending them flying back. Epsilon 41 turned to face Jonathan. "Prepare to be crushed," said Epsilon 41 as he began blazing toward Jonathan. Just before the Augment Master could smash Jonathan, Sig yanked him back to safety. "You can't outlast me," said Epsilon 41 in frustration. "We don't have to," said Lucas as he walked toward the Augment, holding his shining key. "Another child?" shouted Epsilon 41 angrily. "What do you have against an absolute defense?" "The treasure of the shrine," said Lucas calmly. "It was not credits or supplies or tech, as you believed. It is the divine key of origins." "Waving around a religious toy cannot save you," said Epsilon 41 as another rocket hatch burst open on the side of his shell. Before the rocket could launch, Kirana fired a shot with her sniper rifle, causing it to explode inside the augment. Epsilon 41 rolled back slightly in shock. "It has opened my eyes," said Lucas as he pulled his own rifle to the ready. Epsilon 41 opened a hatch to reveal a machine gun barrel, but a well-placed shot by Lucas bent the barrel. Instead of bullets, sparks and smoke poured out of the gun. "It is as if I can see where your suit of armor was made," continued Lucas. "Every piece makes sense to me." "Then you know I have an absolute defense," said Epsilon 41 triumphantly. "Hardly," said Lucas. "Being unaware of your weaknesses does not make them disappear." Lizard suddenly leapt off of the top of the Augment Master. Epsilon 41 spun around as Lizard scurried away. "You weren't even aware that Lizard was on your armor," said Lucas. "You have no idea how many things you have missed when you traded awareness for defense." "I won't miss you, insolent child," shouted Epsilon 41 as he began charging toward Lucas. Sig came up to Victor and whispered, "This is gonna be good." The grin on his face showed his faith in Lucas's plan. Victor was less certain. He did not understand what the divine key of origins had given to Lucas, but he had not liked the plan he had shared when they exited the shrine. The others were so used to Lucas coming up with brilliant plans that they never questioned him, but in spite of the clever trick with the radio to avoid Row 82, the idea he had proposed sounded suicidal. Notwithstanding Victor's doubts, everything happened as Lucas had predicted. They had thrown Epsilon 41 off guard long enough for Lizard to sneak up with the explosive charges and place them in the tank tread in the way that Lucas had directed. Unfortunately, with how fast the tank tread was moving, though, a shot from Lucas would have to be exact for him to set off the charge, defeat the augment, and avoid being crushed. Victor suppressed the urge to rush out and push Lucas out of the way as Epsilon 41 rolled toward him. Lucas remained very calm. He aimed his rifle at the massive ball-shaped tank that focused on him. Lucas squeezed the trigger on his weapon. The bullet spun down the barrel and sped toward Epsilon 41 at tremendous speed. In less than the blink of an eye, the hot round lodged itself into the explosive clay that Lizard had wedged in the side of the treads, causing it to explode. The force of the explosion ripped the tread off of the shell that surrounded Epsilon 41 and forced him off his course, narrowly missing Lucas and crashing into the shrine. Lucas turned and fired another shot that must have hit a rocket inside, because it triggered another explosion that blasted the thick shell slightly apart. Kirana and Jonathan rushed up and began slicing through the exposed cables that bound the shell together. Sparks shot out of the cables as the katanas cut through the insulation that protected them. "How is this possible?" whimpered Epsilon 41 helplessly. "It's amazing what the right amount of explosives can do when put in the right place," said Lucas as everyone gathered around. "My defense was absolute," said Epsilon 41. "There is no absolute defense," said Kirana angrily. The shell burst open to reveal a small, shriveled old man. He shivered helplessly in the cold. Daniel rushed up as the once intimidating and merciless augment coughed in the cold air. "He can't breathe this air. We need to find the filter in his life support to save him," said Daniel. "I admire your love of life, Doctor," said Sig, "but even if we wanted to save him, he is not fit enough to survive." Epsilon 41's head turned to look at Sig. Even as pained and frail as he was, the unmistakable look of anger crossed his wrinkly face. Daniel scowled at Sig's use of the augment's slogan. "He thought that a shell of steel would protect him," explained Sig, "but the best defense is not found in augmentations and slaves. It is found in loyal friends." Daniel's expression softened, and he nodded silently. Sig smiled as he looked at Kirana, Jonathan, Lucas, Daniel, Lizard, and Victor. Sig's words seemed to penetrate everyone, even Epsilon 41. He had become the master of a slaving factory, and dozens of augments had feared him. Slaves had trembled when he had punished them in his torture chambers in the lower levels of the shrine. He suddenly realized that no one was loyal to him or cared for his well-being. Row 82 undoubtedly took what augments remained and fled, knowing that he would be enemy to whoever emerged victorious in this conflict. Epsilon 41, for just a moment, was no longer angry. He experienced an emotion of which he thought he had purged himself long ago. He felt lonely. He closed his eyes as he coughed one more time and then went to sleep. Within another minute, he had frozen to death. Daniel closed his eyes, sad to see a life extinguished. After a few moments of silence, Victor spoke. "The slaves need to be freed," he said. Sig smiled and slapped Victor on the arm. "That's right," he said enthusiastically. He turned to Lizard. "Would you?" Lizard smiled. "I'll take care of it," said Lizard with his characteristic air quotes. He scurried back into the shrine. "He must be handy to have around," said Victor. "So are you," said Sig with a smile. "You'll come with us, won't you?" asked Daniel. "Well, you do have the divine key of origins," said Victor. "Speaking of which," said Lucas with a smile, "I know where another key is." Victor wondered by what coincidence he had come across people that shared the dream of his parents. He glanced back at the shell in which Epsilon 41 had been encased, and then glanced back at his colleagues. He wondered if there were some sort of fate or destiny that had brought him into the company of these new allies. Had he met them any later, he might have gone through with his much less sophisticated plan of shooting his way out, and he would likely have been killed.